gather in reverence before the wonder of life, the wonder of this very moment, the wonder of being together so close yet so apart, each hidden in our own secret chamber, each listening, each trying to speak, yet none fully understanding, none fully understood. We gather in reverence before all intangible things that eyes see not, nor ears can detect, that hands can never touch, that space cannot hold, that time cannot measure. We gather in reverence today. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit for the lighting of our chalice. Please join me in the words of affirmation printed in this morning's program. No other creatures love of life, for they are like you. Kill them not, save their life from fear and enmity. All creatures desire to live, not to die. One who looks on creatures of the earth, big and small, as his own self, truly comprehends this immense world and is indeed an enlightened soul. Be seated. Any youngsters that are with us? I would invite to come forward for the message for all ages on our nice, recently cleaned carpet. Good morning. There are going to be some pictures up there, so you might want to look up once in a while. So here in Wisconsin, we have lots and lots of trees, don't we? Yeah, there are a lot of trees out there, a lot of forests. And Shorewood Hills, where this church is actually a tree city because we take such good care of our trees, and we have so many different kinds of trees. But this is a story about a country where all the trees were disappearing, and a lady that was trying to change that. And the lady's name was Wangari Maathai, and she was born in the country of Kenya in Africa 75 years ago. And at that time, little girls in Kenya usually didn't go to school, and so many of them couldn't read or write or add or subtract. Now, Wangari's parents, they weren't very well schooled either. They hadn't gone to school very much. But they wanted their daughter to have a better life than they had, and so they were determined to send her to school, which actually cost some money. So they had to pay some money for her to go to school. And Wangari wasn't able to start school until she was 8 years old because they didn't have enough money. Most of you start school when? 5 or 6 years old? Yeah, so she was a little late. Yeah. But she was so good in school, she was so smart that she finished elementary school. And then she went on to go to high school, which very, very few girls were able to do. And she got such good grades in high school that there was a college here in the United States, thousands of miles away, that offered her a scholarship. They were going to pay for all of her expenses to go to college here in the United States. And she was going to study biology because she was really very, very interested in life, and what life is all about, how life works. And so she got her degree in biology from this little college out in Kansas. And then she did so well there that she was offered a scholarship to get her master's degree in biology in Pennsylvania at the University of Pittsburgh. So she went and got a master's degree, but at that time, she'd been in the United States for about 6 years, and she was homesick. And she really wanted to go back home to Kenya. And so she did, but she went back to school when she got to Kenya. She went to the university in the capital city of Nairobi, and she got a doctoral degree in biology, which is the highest degree you can get. And she was the first woman in all of East Africa to get that kind of a degree. Now, when she came back, Wangari was kind of disappointed, angry, sad, because she noticed that a lot of the trees that she had remembered being in Kenya were being cut down. A lot of the forests were being cleared, because business interests in the government were building more and more houses, and they were clearing the forest to be able to grow cereal crops like corn and wheat. And Wangari was afraid that after a while there weren't going to be any forests left. And when the forests are gone, what happens to the animals in the forest? They'll all die out. That's right. They lost their habitat. Very good. And in addition, some of those trees in the forest had fruit on them and nuts on them, and poor people used the nuts and fruit from those trees to get enough to eat. So Wangari was a scientist, but she knew that she was going to have to do something to change this situation. And so she started a movement called the Green Belt Movement. And the Green Belt Movement was one in which a whole lot of different people got together to plant and to grow lots and lots of new trees in Kenya. Now, who was going to plant all these trees? Wangari couldn't plant them herself. Well, she went to village after village talking to women, poor women, who usually didn't know how to read and write and didn't have any marketable skills. They really couldn't get jobs. And she said, I'll pay you a little bit if you'll help me plant trees. And she got 30,000 women in Kenya to help her plant trees. And how many trees do you think they planted? 30 million trees. That was the Green Belt Movement all over Kenya. Now, this was very important work, but there were some that did not like what Wangari Maathai was doing because she was challenging her government and the business interests who wanted to keep on developing the country and cutting down the trees for new houses and for cropland. And so sometimes when Wangari was out protesting a new development, these people would come up from the government and they would beat her up and beat her friends up. But that didn't stop her from doing her work. And as she continued to plant trees and to recruit women, she became more and more famous and more popular. And eventually she was elected to a high government office where she was in charge of all the wildlife and all the natural resources. And so because of Wangari Maathai, Kenya today has lots more trees than it used to, a lot more women who have skills that they didn't have before, and what we call a more robust democracy. More people are participating in the life of that country. Well, eventually people all over the world heard about the Green Belt Movement and what Wangari was doing. And in 2004, she was given the biggest, most important prize that anybody in the world can get. Anybody know what that prize is? The Nobel Peace Prize. You're absolutely right. And so she remains an inspiring example to all of us about what one person can do for positive change. And so we continue our service with two selections. The first from Annie Dillard's classic, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. I don't know what it is about fecundity that so appalls. I suppose it is the teeming evidence that birth and growth, which we value, are so ubiquitous and blind, that life itself is astonishingly cheap, and that nature is as careless as it is bountiful, and that with this extravagance comes a crushing waste that one day will include our own cheap lives. The naturalist Edwin Way Teale reports that a lone aphid, without a partner, breeding unmolested for 1 year, will produce so many living aphids that although they are only 1/10 of an inch long, together they would extend into space 2,500 light years. Even the average goldfish lays 5,000 eggs, which she will eat as fast as she lays them if permitted to do so. The pressure of growth among animals is a kind of terrible hunger. These billions must eat in order to fuel their surge to sexual maturity so that they can pump out billions and billions of more eggs. There is a terrible innocence in the benumbed world of the lower animals, reducing life there to a universal chomp. What kind of a world is this anyway? Why not make fewer barnacle larvae and give them a decent chance? Are we dealing with life here or with death? I have to look at the landscape of the blue-green world again, and I have to acknowledge that the sea is a cup of death and the land is a stained altar stone. Evolution loves death more than it loves you or me. That's easy to write, easy to read, and very hard to believe. The words are simple. The concept is clear. You don't believe it, do you? Neither do I. We humans, we value the individual supremely. Nature values him not a whit. So either this world, my mother, is a monster, or I myself am a freak. Consider the former, that the world is a monster. Any 3-year-old can see how unsatisfactory, how clumsy is this whole business of reproducing and dying by the billions and the billions. We have not yet encountered any God who is as merciful as a man who flicks a beetle back onto its feet. There's not a people in the world that behaves as badly as the praying mantis. We are moral creatures, then, in an amoral world. But then I must consider the alternative, that creation itself is blameless, benevolently askew by its very free nature, and that it's only this human feeling that is so freakishly amiss. Does the barnacle larva care? Does the lacewing who eats her eggs care? If they don't care, why am I making all this fuss? If I'm a freak, why don't I just hush? All right, then. It is our emotions that are amiss. We are freaks. The world is fine. So let us all go out and have lobotomies to restore us to our natural state. We can leave the library, go back to the creek lobotomized, and live on its banks as untroubled as any muskrat or reed. You go first. The second reading, in a slightly different but related vein, from the naturalist Lauren Isley's book, The Unexpected Universe, one of my favorite passages in all of his remarkable work. The beaches of Costa Bell are littered with the debris of life. Shells are cast up in windrows. A hermit crab, fumbling for a new home in the depths, is tossed ashore naked, where the waiting gulls cut him to pieces. Along a strip of wet sand that marks the ebbing and flowing of the tide, death walks hugely and in many forms. Even the torn fragments of green sponge yield bits of scrambling life, struggling to return to the great mother that has nourished them, that has protected them. Now, one morning, as the ebb was flowing, and as soon as I could make out in my sleeplessness the flashlights on the beach, I arose. I dressed in the dark, and coming down the steps to the shore, I could hear the deeper rumble of the surf. As I walked the beach, up ahead of me, over the projecting point, a gigantic rainbow of incredible perfection had sprung shimmering into existence. And somewhere toward its foot, I discerned this human figure standing, as it seemed to me, within that rainbow. And he was gazing fixedly at something down in the sand. Eventually, he stooped and flung the object beyond the breaking surf. I labored toward him over a half-mile of uncertain footing, and by the time I reached him, the rainbow had receded ahead of us, but something of its color still ran hastily and in changing lights across this man's features. He was starting to kneel again. In a pool of sand and silt, I saw that a starfish had thrust its arms up stiffly and was holding its body away from the stifling mud. "It's still alive," I ventured. "Yes," he replied, and with a quick yet gentle movement, he picked up the star and flung it over my head and far out into the sea. It sank in a burst of spume, and the waters roared once more. "It may live," he said, "if the offshore pull is strong enough." He spoke gently, and across his bronzed, worn face, the light came and went in subtly altering colors. "There are not many that come this far," I said, groping in a sudden embarrassment for words. "Do you collect?" "Only like this," he said softly, "and only for the living." He stooped again, oblivious to my curiosity, skipped another star neatly across the water. "The stars," he said, "they throw well. One can help them." He looked full at me with a faint question kindling in his eyes which seemed to me to take on the far depths of the sea. "I do not collect," I said uncomfortably, "neither the living nor the dead. Gave it up long ago. Death is the only successful collector." I nodded and walked away, leaving him there upon the dune with that great rainbow ranging up in the sky behind him. But I turned as I neared a bend in the coast, and I saw him toss another star, skimming it skillfully far out over the ravening and tumultuous waters. And for a moment, in that changing light, the sower of stars appeared magnified, as though casting larger stars upon some greater sea. He had, at any rate, the posture of a god. It is a lovely piece. On September 4th, 1965, Dr. Albert Schweitzer died at the hospital that he oversaw and in which he had practiced medicine for over a half-century. He was 90 years old, and the old man chose to die here at Lamborghini in equatorial Africa rather than in his native Europe because, as he put it to his fellow workers, "I feel at home here and I belong to you until my dying breath. By the time of his death, Schweitzer had become one of the 20th century's most admired figures and one of civilization's last true Renaissance men. He was a theologian, a meticulous biblical scholar whose book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, remains a classic. He was a consummate musician who began serving as a church organist at the age of 11, and he later became chief organist for the Paris Bach Society. As an organist, he was enchanted by the music of J.S. Bach, whom he once described as a poet and painter in sound. Schweitzer also earned a reputation as a builder and restorer of fine pipe organs. This was painstaking work, took a lot of time, and at one point he wished he had never troubled himself about it. But the reason he said that he did not give up the struggle for the good organ is that for him it was part of his struggle for truth. Although his medical practice in equatorial Africa was consuming, Schweitzer, even there, found time to write several major works of philosophy and, in later years, to join with eminent figures like Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein in the campaign for nuclear disarmament and world peace. And, of course, he served tens of thousands of African patients in one of the remotest medical facilities on the continent. George Marshall, his biographer, says that he was a participant at all times in and a forerunner of every major social and humanitarian movement of the 20th century. As his reputation spread, Schweitzer was feted with honorary degrees, citations, commemorative stamps, and in 1954, the Nobel Peace Prize. But despite the honors heaped upon him, Schweitzer remained self-effacing. He did not preen, he did not utter cosmic statements at the drop of a cause, a correspondent for Reuters news service noted shortly after his death. And the writer went on to say, Schweitzer seemed to many observers to be a simple, almost rustic man who dressed in rumpled clothing, suffered fools gladly, stated fundamental verities patiently, worked unobtrusively, and yet he was by no means a man with a weak ego. Some of his most ardent admirers insisted that he was a jungle saint, but Schweitzer rejected such adulation, holding that his spiritual life was its own reward and that his works redeemed him. Well, today, Schweitzer's aesthetic, intellectual, and humanitarian contributions to Western culture are little remembered. But there is one concept that will forever be associated with his name, and that's the concept of reverence for life, a categorical imperative that consistently informed his own life's work to a degree that most of us would find very hard to fathom. In Schweitzer's own telling of the story, this axiom, reverence for life, came to him as a sudden and unbidden epiphany while he was riding aboard a river raft bound for a distant village to treat a patient. Now, for a physician in an underdeveloped part of the world like this, a house call might require a week or more of uncomfortable travel, and it did in this particular instance. But it was on trips like this that Schweitzer found the time for deep philosophical reflection. And he had long been searching for, as he put it, a universal conception of the ethical. And for 3 days on that raft, he had covered sheet after sheet of paper with disconnected thoughts and fragments of ideas. But then late on the third day, as a helmsman was guiding the raft through a herd of hippopotamuses, the iron door yielded, and there flashed upon Schweitzer's consciousness that perfect formula, reverence for life. Now, he said, I had found my way to the idea in which world and life affirmation and ethics are contained side by side. But while this succinct ethical formula seemed to have arrived to his mind unbidden, it had already found ample expression in Schweitzer's life. He was the son of a liberal Protestant minister, and when young, he was taught his bedtime prayers by his mother. But early on, the youngster was troubled by the fact that all of these prayers that he was taught focused exclusively on human beings and on the individual's own private interests. And so after his mother had tucked him in, young Albert would add to the received prayers a personal one that he had made up. Bless and protect all things that have breath. Guard them from evil, and let them sleep in peace. Years later, and as a young man, Schweitzer excelled in several academic disciplines, including biblical criticism. And from his extensive research into the Gospels, he became convinced that any true disciple of Jesus should heed his call to personal sacrifice. And Schweitzer thus resolved, at about the age of 28, that he would devote the first 30 years of his life to scholarship and to art, but then he would spend the remainder of his years in direct service to humanity. Many a time already, he wrote, I had tried to settle the meaning that lay hidden for me in that saying of Jesus, whoever would save his life shall lose it, and whoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's shall save it. Now, he said, the answer was found, and in addition to the outward, I now had inward happiness. And so after a period of discernment, Schweitzer resolved to become a missionary doctor, practicing in a place where the need for a skilled physician was great. He said, I wanted to be a doctor so that I might be able to work without having to talk. In this way, he felt he would be putting the law of love into actual practice. His friends and his families thought that he was being utterly irresponsible for rejecting the talent that had been entrusted to him. But Schweitzer, for his part, was disappointed that they, as Christians, could not see how the love preached by Jesus may sweep a man into an entirely new course of life. Now, for Schweitzer, the principle of reverence for life was a logical extension of the all-embracing love that was so central to Jesus' preaching. The truth that the ethical is the essence of religion is firmly established in the authority of Jesus, he wrote, and the Sermon on the Mount is the incontestable charter of liberal Christianity. On another occasion, he said, the ethic of reverence for life is the ethic that Jesus had, brought now to philosophic expression, extended into cosmical form, and conceived as intellectually necessary. Okay, what did Schweitzer mean by reverence for life? And with respect to our own regard for and conduct toward other creatures, other human beings, what does it imply for any of us? Well, when you hear that phrase initially, you might well visualize a figure like Lauren Isley's star thrower, a somewhat eccentric figure bent on rescuing creatures whom nature has consigned to oblivion. Could be a starfish washed ashore with the tide. Could be earthworms writhing on a hot sidewalk after a heavy rain. Could be Mother Teresa pulling lepers off the streets of Calcutta in a noble effort to ease at least some degree of suffering. And Schweitzer himself strove to be as considerate toward human beings and other sentient creatures who were threatened by harm as considerate as he possibly could be. As he oversaw the construction of new facilities at his jungle hospital, the doctor would make it a point every morning to go out and to inspect each excavated post hole and trench in order to retrieve any small creature that might have stumbled into those cavities during the night. And only after he had made his rounds could work then continue. Our own former music director and guest artist, Carlos Mosier, tells me that he once met Schweitzer when he was studying in Europe music and conducting. And Carlos shared with me an incident, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, that reportedly occurred when Adlai Stevenson visited Schweitzer in Lamborghini. And the doctor and the statesman were engaged in deep conversation when a mosquito landed on Schweitzer's arm. And automatically, Stevenson casually swatted the mosquito. At which point, Schweitzer reprimanded him, saying, "That was my mosquito." But life, as Annie Dillard wrote, is cheap. And evolution seems to love death more than it loves you or me. Dillard questions whether her own deep regard for sentient life isn't irrational, a sentimental quirk. Among nature's myriad creatures, she observes, humans seem unique in their concern for the fate of other life forms. And I suspect that Schweitzer, a scientist by training, was cognizant of all of this. And yet for him, this concept of reverence for life invested human life with meaning. In his maturity, Schweitzer eschewed supernaturalism. He did not present reverence for life as some God-given mandate. He was not conventionally religious, and while the principle was for him an outgrowth of the teachings of Jesus, Schweitzer felt that it was of a piece with the finer elements of human nature, that reverence for life reflected our rationalism, our altruism, our native-born compassion. And so he often characterized reverence for life as a mysticism of reality, because it could be experientially verified, but it was, like all mysticisms, in some sense, inexplicable. Now, to those, his critics, who questioned the principle's rationality, Schweitzer asked, in what sense is violence rational? Look at World Wars I and II. Millions of combatants, tens of millions of civilians, uncounted millions of animals killed in those conflicts. Why? Why? Because, he said, we did not possess the highest rationalism, the rationalism of reverence for life. He continued, because we do not yet possess this. Every people is afraid of every other. Each causes fear to the other. We are mentally afflicted one for the other because we are lacking in rationality. And there is no other remedy than reverence for life, and at this we must arrive. The principle accords with reason for yet another reason, because it leads to happiness, because reverence for life fulfills our humanity. It is through an ever-widening investment in the lives of others, an acknowledgement that their will to live is of no lesser value than my will to live, that we move, Schweitzer said, from thinghood to egohood to the freedom and the integrity of personhood. Schweitzer believed, and he felt this was true for himself, that the saving and promotion of life delivers the deepest happiness that can ever befall a human being. Now, he did not deny that his ethic demanded a measure of personal sacrifice. Schweitzer himself had left a life of material comfort, academic acclaim, pursuits that he truly loved, in order to become a missionary doctor. Go thou and do likewise, he urged. The ethic of reverence for life, he said, constrains all of us, no matter what our walk of life, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, constrains us to help those who are in need. It does not allow the scholar to live for his science alone, even though that science may be useful to the community in which he lives. It does not permit the artist to exist only for his art, even if he gives inspiration by its means. It refuses to let the businessman imagine that he fulfills all legitimate demands in the course of his business activities. Rather, it demands from all that they should sacrifice a portion of their lives for others. Now, let's be clear here. Schweitzer was offering a general principle and not a detailed prescription. He did not provide us with a yardstick by which we measure our sacrifices against somebody else's. Everyone, he said, must decide on the basis of the thoughts that arise within themselves, the circumstances that attend the course of their own life, how best to proceed. If you apply your reason to the problem, he said, you will know what you have to do. Reason. But not reason exclusively, because we also need reverence. And reverence, that's the mystical side of the equation. Jackson Ice says that to revere is to discover something awesome, something holy. And according to the philosopher Paul Woodruff, it is also the virtue, reverence, that keeps us humble, free from hubris. An exclusive reliance on rationality can cause us to overestimate our capabilities and thus to become arrogant. Reverence, Woodruff says, is most obvious when it is missing. And it is missing in most people who are, or who think they are, exceptional. Reason and reverence. In Schweitzer's ethic, the two presupposed and complemented each other. Now, of course, the phrase reverence for life may have been new, but the principle itself was hardly without precedent. The religious order known as the Jains and a significant segment of Buddhists have been embracing the doctrine of ahimsa, or non-harm, for over 2,500 years. And Mahatma Gandhi, Schweitzer's contemporary, allowed snakes and scorpions and spiders to wander freely in his ashram because he, like Schweitzer, was convinced that every creature had a right to blossom and to fulfill itself. Now, Schweitzer's critics argued that his ethic was both impractical and unrealistic because it failed honestly to acknowledge the harm that we cannot avoid inflicting on other living beings. But Schweitzer, who witnessed death on a daily basis in Africa, was hardly unaware of this, and he readily conceded that life preys on other life. But he staunchly defended an ethos of care. Reverence for life obliges us only to work diligently on ourselves as we strive to become increasingly conscious of and compassionate toward other members of the biotic community. Albert Schweitzer was an unusually sensitive man, a gifted man. He had many admirable traits. But he was not without his flaws. In pursuing his medical practice, he neglected his role as husband and father. He presided over the hospital at Lamborghini as an autocrat, a taskmaster with high expectations and with a low tolerance for criticism. He was also a product of his time, paternalistic, convinced of the merits of the European colonialist system. Now, Schweitzer was more respectful of Africa's indigenous cultures than most white Europeans at the time, and he even argued that the native population was entitled to reparations for the losses that they had suffered at the hands of the colonial regimes. And yet, he always regarded black Africans as children in need of white supervision. Schweitzer inveighed against the liberation movements of the 1950s and 60s, which prompted W.E.B. Du Bois to call him the last of the great white fathers. Du Bois evinced grudging respect for Schweitzer, commending him for, as he put it, his efforts to alleviate the pain and the degradation of this small bit of God's earth. But Du Bois also said that in doing so, Schweitzer perpetuated colonialism by making life more comfortable under it. Schweitzer, he said, could have done better to focus on saving the souls of white men rather than the bodies of black ones. But be that as it may, Albert Schweitzer was saving lives, thousands of lives, during a period when the European powers, the Belgians in the Congo, the Germans in Southwest Africa, the Italians in Ethiopia, the French in Algeria, when these regimes were killing and maiming Africans by the tens of millions. So whatever his failings, Schweitzer did manage to rise above the sentiment that privileged European lives over those of Africans, and that regarded the latter, the Africans, as an exploitable commodity. So as a civilization, have we made any progress in the 50 years since Schweitzer's death? Has the principle of reverence for life gained greater acceptance, more traction? With daily media reports of murder and mayhem, we might not think so. But Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker's recent analysis of the global evidence does suggest that overall, there is less human carnage in our world today than there used to be. He says that the statistics suggest that this may be the most peaceable time in our species' existence. Now, he says that many factors may have contributed to the decline of intraspecies violence. But for any small part that Albert Schweitzer's reverence for life may have played, we owe him a debt of gratitude. Thank you. That doesn't happen very often, so I'll take it as it comes. And so appropriately, we leave with these thoughts from Albert Schweitzer. The deeper we look into nature, the more we recognize that it is full of life, and the more profoundly we know that all life is a secret and that we are united to all life that is in nature. Man can no longer live his life for himself alone. We must realize that all life is valuable, that we are united to all of this life. And from this knowledge comes our spiritual relationship to the universe. Blessed be and amen.